Welcome back to the final part of our 4-part series for Module 3. In the first 3 parts, we stayed inside our high-risk playground, focusing on works and small infrastructure projects. We learned how to use the reporting template tool to spot 3 main corruption schemes in construction: unjustified contract changes or scope creep, substandard or undelivered works compared to payments, and irregular or phantom subcontracting. But in reality, your monitoring sample will not always be 100% construction. You'll also notice things in goods and service contracts, such as medical equipment, school furniture, IT hardware, or even studies, consultancy, design, cleaning, and software maintenance. So even if the current online iMonitor tool focuses on works, the same 3 corruption schemes often appear in goods and services. Through scope creep and expensive add-ons, poor quality and missing items compared to what was paid, and ghost experts or even hidden subcontractors doing the actual work. So in this final part, we're going to focus on 2 things. We'll show you how mock-up questions for goods and services follow the same logic as the works add-ons, and we'll also give you a checklist mindset. So what to look for invoices, delivery notes, acceptance acts, timesheets, and authorship, even if the online tool doesn't necessarily have these exact screens yet. So everything you'll see in the next few slides is clearly marked as training mock-up, but the logic is very real and very useful whenever your project is a goods or service contract in order to spot red flags easily. Now before we dive in, there's one important clarification. The screenshots you'll see here in this part are not real, currently available views in the online monitor tool. So they're training mock-ups designed in the same style as the works add-ons so that you can immediately recognize the logic. Why do we still spend time on goods and services? Well, first, because your monitoring sample will always include a mix of contract types. A school roof here, but also computers for the school, and maybe even a consultancy to design the new curriculum. Second, because the 3 corruption schemes do not stop at concrete and tarmac. Scope creep, overbilling, and phantom implementers can just as easily hide in medical devices, cleaning contracts, or advisory services. And lastly, because these contracts support the same public policies, all linked to health, education, and social inclusion. So if we only watch the works and ignore the supplies and services, we miss half the story. So, how should you read the next slides? Treat each mock-up screen as a checklist. If you ever monitor a goods or service project, these are the questions you can ask yourself, even if you have to write the answers in a free text box or in your own notes. And if in the future the online tool is expanded for goods and services, these are exactly the kind of add-on questions that we would want to include. I'll repeat this once more later, but please do not worry if you don't see these screens in your real account. The value is in the logic behind them. First, let's take a look at the big picture for goods contracts. Imagine you're monitoring medical fridges, laptops, school furniture, or even road sign kits. The basic questions are very similar to works, but the evidence is clearly easier to move and hide because it fits in pallets or even in boxes. So for goods, we would like the tool to guide you through 4 quick checks. Firstly, where are the items? Can you actually see them, or are they in the storeroom, maybe in the warehouse, or already installed at the end user location? Or do you only have invoice on paper? Secondly, what was actually delivered? Make sure that you look at the model, the quantity, and any serial or lot numbers visible on the labels, because this is where the model swap and quality downgrade often happens. Thirdly, what was actually paid? Compare the invoice and payment order with the delivery note and with what you see physically. This is our classic paid does not equal received situation. Now, lastly, we need to look at who delivered or installed the goods. Sometimes a third-party logistics firm or even an installer appears who's not actually on the contract. So that may be fine, or it may be a hidden channel for profit or influence. So in terms of schemes, if we take a look at our 3 corruption schemes, substandard or undelivered goods compared to what was paid clearly links to corruption scheme 2. Another pattern to detect is corruption scheme 3 angle if an unlisted logistics firm or installers appear in the story. And just like with works, you could see access obstruction. So the storeroom is closed, or maybe it says the items are in an off-site warehouse, come back later. It's a soft but important warning signal. So the next slides walk you through these checks one by one using mock-up goods questions in the reporting template style. Here you'll see that the first goods box mirrors the step 2 access questions you already know from works. So the problem with goods is that they're easy to move and easy to hide. If something's wrong, let's say a wrong product, or it's not the right amount of quantity, even expired stock, the first reaction may be to keep monitors away from the storeroom or warehouse. So the mock-up asks 3 things. Were you able to carry out a site visit where the items are stored or installed? If not, did you at least attempt to visit the storeroom, warehouse, or end user location? And if that attempt also failed, who declined or prevented access, on what date and with what explanation? So, how do we read this? If monitors simply click no visit and make no attempt to see where the items are, we have a clear monitoring gap here. We just don't know what's happening. So if monitors did try and were blocked, we'd need to record this as a control weakness. It doesn't prove corruption, but it definitely tells us independent verification of goods is difficult in this project. So in practice, your description might sound like, attempted to visit school storeroom on 12th of May, access refused by school director, reason given, inventory in progress, come after audit. Later, if we see problems with quantities or models, this access story will help us understand the context. So it's definitely a red flag background signal for corruption scheme 2 or 3. Now if we move to the first practical check for goods, do the documents match what actually arrived? So if you look at the question in the box here, it says, do invoices or packing lists match the model or specifications and quantity received? And make sure to look at the note, please note any variance above 2%. So in practice, you as monitors do 4 simple things here. You put the invoice, the packing list, and the delivery note side by side. You make sure to look at the model or type and the specification on the labels of the items. So for example, laptop model X123, 16GB RAM, or fridge model A with energy label A+++. So what you do here is you count a small sample of units for each key item. You don't have to count every single screw, but you do really need to note if there are clearly fewer or more pieces than were paid. So if you see any difference greater than about 2%, you need to note this down and write a short explanation in the box. But why is this important for corruption risks? Well, if the model or specification is different but the price is the same, this is a classic corruption scheme 2 pattern, a model swap or quality downgrade. So on paper, the administration paid for a higher quality item, but in reality, you've noticed a cheaper, weaker model arrived. Now, if fewer units are delivered than in the invoice, again, this is straight corruption scheme 2 red flags, undelivered goods compared to payment. But if extra units appear with no paperwork, it may also still be suspicious. It can mean someone plans to reuse the invoice for another delivery or move extra items somewhere else without records. And finally, if you see many small mismatches across several items, even if each one looks minor, that tells us controls are weak and it becomes much easier to hide a serious problem. So your job is not to accuse anyone, we've made that very clear throughout Module 3, but your job is to describe. So for example, invoice and packing list, 10 printers, Model A, delivery note and labels, 8 printers, Model A, 2 printers, Model B, variance above 2% noted, photos attached. So with just one field, you're already very close to detecting corruption scheme 2, substandard or undelivered goods compared to what was actually paid. The second part of the goods checks looks at paperwork behind the boxes, so conformity documents and serial or lot numbers. The question here is, were required conformity documents captured and serial lot numbers recorded? As monitors, what do you actually do? Well, first you tick yes or no for conformity documents, but you need to look for things like CE declarations or declarations of conformity, which may include test reports, energy labels for fridges, lights, equipment. And then second, you need to write which documents you saw and where they were. So CE/doc attached to delivery note or energy labels photographed and saved in Annex X. Third, you check whether serial or lot numbers are recorded, whether it be on delivery notes, a separate asset register, or even in your own monitoring form. And for a few important items like medical devices or IT services, expensive machines and so on, you would write down or photograph the serial or lot numbers on the labels. But how do we interpret this for corruption risks? If conformity documents are missing or incomplete, that's a clear safety and compliance red flag. It may mean that the goods do not meet the required standards or even that the supplier is cutting corners. So this links back to corruption scheme 2 again, because poor quality or non-compliant goods were accepted as if they were fully compliant. Now, if the documents refer to a different model than the one actually delivered, that can also indicate a model swap or even fake documentation, again, a corruption scheme 2 issue. So if no serial or lot numbers are recorded, let's say for high risk or high value items, then it becomes very hard to actually prove what was delivered or to react in case of recalls or defects. So it also makes it much easier to swap equipment later on, or even move to another location without anyone actually noticing. So again, your language needs to stay neutral and factual. For example, declaration and test report attached for Model A, however, delivered items are Model B, serial numbers of 5 units recorded and attached in Annex. But when we combine this slide with the previous one, we get a very solid picture of goods delivery versus payment. What was ordered, what arrived, whether it is compliant, and whether it can be traced. So all of that feeds directly into spotting corruption scheme 2 in goods contracts. Here we now zoom in on the money side of the goods story. So in many cases you'll find that the paper trail is internally consistent. The invoice, delivery note and payment order all show the same quantity. The question lies in whether that quantity was truly received. So this add-on takes just one extra step. After you've checked what was delivered and what appears on the invoice, you need to look at the payment order in the finance system. Then you answer, do paid quantities match received quantities for the checked items? Some typical patterns can look like, let's say if everything aligns, 10 laptops ordered, 10 delivered, 10 paid, and you can see the laptops, that's a reassuring result. But if the payment order shows 100% payment and the items you've checked are missing or incomplete, that's a strong corruption 2 red flag. Now, if the payment is for more expensive Model A, but only Model B is installed, we still have a paid too much for a lower specification situation. Again, corruption scheme 2 and potentially even fraud. So your text box might say, payment order 45-2025 paid full invoice for 10 times Model A devices on 30th of June. On 15th of July, only 8 devices were present in storeroom. Labels show Model B. Variance, 2 units, model downgrade, A to B. It's precise, neutral, and gives auditors exactly why they need to go deeper. If goods were included in the reporting template tool, this add-on here sits directly under the question, are other contract provisions being fulfilled? And it focuses on who actually moved and installed the goods. Now, in many goods contracts, the main supplier promises a complete package, delivery to the end user location, installation or configuration, and sometimes even initial training. But in practice, another company may appear on the scene. We suggested this as a logistics firm or even an installer, whose name never appears in the contract or even in the subcontracting table. So on this screen, your job is quite simple. First, you need to tick yes or no depending on whether you see any third-party logistics providers or installers involved. But if you tick yes, make sure to write down the name or logo that you observe and a few words about their role. So for example, Trans-Euro Logistics, trucks and uniforms at hospital equipment delivery, or Install Tech SRL, logo on van installing solar panels at school. Also make sure to note where you saw them. This could be in the warehouse, at the clinic, or even at a school storeroom. But how do we interpret this? So an unlisted logistics firm or installer is not automatically illegal. Sometimes a ministry does have a separate framework contract for transport or even a shared warehouse service. However, from a corruption risk perspective, it can definitely be a sign of corruption scheme 3, irregular or phantom subcontracting. So front companies winning contracts on paper and passing all real work to others, or politically connected firms gaining a slice of the contract without being visible in the tender, or even money flowing through chains that are very hard to follow on. So if you notice the same unlisted company appearing again and again across different projects, it's an especially important pattern to flag. Your role is not to accuse anyone, but it is to document neutrally. So let's say unlisted firm Trans-Euro Logistics delivered and unloaded equipment at City Hospital, logo on 2 trucks and workers' vests, 12th of March 2026. Now this is exactly the kind of detail that allows investigators or auditors to follow up later on potential corruption scheme 3 cases. This second add-on here, under Are Other Contract Provisions Being Fulfilled, looks at the handover to the end user, so warranty, manuals and basic training. Very often the tender for goods doesn't actually only buy boxes, it buys the equipment itself, a warranty, user manuals in the local language, and sometimes even a short training session so that nurses, teachers or even technicians can actually use the items given. So on this screen you see tick yes or no depending on whether warranty activation, manuals and basic training have been provided. But if you tick no or can't answer, you need to explain exactly what is missing. So for example, devices installed but no warranty card or activation documents found, or new laptops delivered but the teachers say they received no training and cannot log in. Also make sure to mention where you checked this, so it could be in the clinic ward, in the school lab, at the municipal store, or whether staff members themselves even confirmed it. But why does this matter for integrity? First, from a quality and sustainability angle, if there is no warranty, no manuals, and no training, the risk is that the equipment sits unused or even misused, or breaks quickly with no support. Second, from a corruption scheme perspective, if the contract price clearly includes supply and installation and training, but in reality you've noticed only the physical goods were delivered, we're very close to corruption scheme 2. Substandard or undelivered elements compared to payment. So in other words, the buyer may have paid for a complete package, but the end user only received the hardware. Now, good handover, on the other hand, is a positive signal. Manuals are available, someone can show you the warranty card or online activation, and staff can tell you they attended a short training and can operate the equipment. That doesn't magically remove all risks in the procurement, but it does mean that the project is more resilient and delivers real value to citizens. So again, your role as monitors is to write short factual notes. Now, this kind of neutral description tells a very clear story about whether the contract has been fulfilled beyond just the invoice. Now let's switch to service contracts. So services are tricky because there's no actual physical object you can measure with a tape. Instead, you're dealing here with deliverables such as reports, designs, training sessions, time, which is expert days, hours and meetings, and people, so the named consultants or experts who are supposed to be doing the work. Now for services we suggest 4 main checks. First, is there a written acceptance note that clearly says what was delivered and that it met the agreed criteria? Second, do timesheets or activity logs line up with the outputs? So is there a reasonable relationship between days billed and work produced? Third, do the authors or consultants named in the deliverables match the supplier and subcontractor list in the contract, or are there any ghost experts involved? And lastly, if the contract was extended or new tasks were added, were those changes signed before delivery or only after the fact? Now, in terms of corruption schemes, Scheme 2 appears as ghost deliverables, high invoices but very little work, or even recycled reports. Scheme 1 appears as scope creep, so new tasks quietly added without proper justification. And thirdly, Corruption Scheme 3 appears as ghost experts or hidden subcontractors. The people doing the work are not the ones in the contract. So the next slides show how mock-up service questions in the template could help you structure these checks. The first big question you can see here in service contracts is, who said the work was finished and how? For works we've seen that delivery notes and completion certificates are necessary, but for services we usually have what's known as an acceptance note, sometimes called a completion certificate, approved email, or even a protocol. So this field asks a very simple thing. Was the service accepted in writing? If yes, which document, on what date, and does it mention any criteria? But when you find that document, don't get lost in the legal language. Just make sure to check 3 basic things. Firstly, was it signed and is it dated? Is it clearly linked to this contract or purchased order? And does it mention concrete deliverables or criteria? So, for example, 3 training sessions delivered and a final report of at least 30 pages. Or, urban plan updated with new zoning maps attached. But from an integrity perspective, no written acceptance at all is a serious control weakness. It opens the door to ghost deliverables such as invoices being paid without any formal decision from something that was delivered. Now, sometimes there are vague sentences that are included like services delivered satisfactorily with no link to the contract outputs, which is also a warning sign, especially if the amount is high. It suggests that someone signed off without really checking. But a clear concrete acceptance note is much better, but only if we want you to cross-check whether the real report, design or training materials match the spirit of what was supposed to be delivered. So your role as monitors is not to redo the consultant's job. Your role is really just to confirm that there is a traceable written decision saying yes, these services were delivered, and to highlight when that decision is missing vague or badly timed. The second big service question is about billing versus real work. So many service contracts are paid on a daily or hourly rate to consultants, trainers, IT experts and engineers. In all of those cases, the money is driven by 2 ingredients, the number of days or hours billed and the outputs that they have produced, which could be reports, designs, training sessions and software modules. So this field simply asks, if time-based billing applies, were the timesheets or activity logs actually reconciled to the outputs? So, what do you do as monitors? Well, first you need to check whether the contract or terms of reference mentions time-based billing. So, for example, 100 expert days at €400 per day. Then ask for the timesheets or activity logs and look at the main deliverables, so the reports, the designs, training agendas, minutes, and so on. In the comment box, if it were in the reporting template tool, here you would briefly describe what you see. So red flag patterns for corruption scheme 2 would be overbilling or ghost work, including very high numbers of billed days, but only a short memo or a few slides as final report. Copy-paste timesheets, so every month the same description, same hours, but no link to specific tasks. Timesheets that clearly extend beyond the contract period without any formal extension are also relevant here. But if you're not allowed to see the timesheets at all, you simply record that. So you need to say timesheets requested but not provided, cannot reconcile hours to outputs. That information gap is itself a control weakness. But on the positive side, if hours and outputs match, for example 10 workship days, and you see agendas, participant lists, materials, and a solid final report, then you can tick yes and briefly say so. Again, the aim is not for you to judge whether the consultant's advice was brilliant, but the aim is to see whether the money paid for time has at least a reasonable trace in real work, or whether the pattern looks more like a billing first and figuring out outputs later. After looking at acceptance notes and timesheets, the third big services question is what happened when the contract changed. So for this box, you would only activate it where there is some sign of modification. Let's say there were extra months included, or new tasks, or maybe even a phase 2 of a study or additional supervision for a small construction project. Now the question we ask is very simple. Were those extensions or new tasks formally signed and justified before the consultant did the extra work? So as monitors, you'd look for an amendment or task order. Could be a short document signed and dated that says something like contract extended by 3 months due to delayed works, or even additional design options requested. You don't have to be a procurement lawyer, you just need to see if 1. The document exists, 2. It is clearly linked to this contract, and 3. The date makes sense. It comes before the extra work was delivered. So if there's no amendment at all, or even if it appears only after the extra invoices were paid, that's where we see Corruption Scheme 1, scope creep and unjustified growth of the contract. So in practice, especially around small infrastructure or construction-related services, this could often look like supervision engineers staying on site for months longer than planned with lots of billed days but no clear written decision authorising that. Now, this could also look like new studies, drawings or soil tests commissioned informally from the same consultant without any competition or clear reason. It could also look like amendments with very vague wording such as due to delays while the value of the contract doubles. So all of those patterns don't automatically prove corruption, but what they do show is that the changes are happening outside the normal control system. So your role is simple. Tick no or can't answer, describe what you see in a sentence, and flag that this is where scope creep or favoritism could be hiding. The fourth and final service question goes to the heart of who actually did the work. On paper, the contract and the winning tender usually list a nice team, usually including senior consultant, key experts, and maybe even a specialist lab or a local design partner. But in practice, especially around small infrastructure projects, the work might be carried out by a completely different firm or people. Again, remember that in this project we're working with hypothetical add-ons to the reporting template tool. So the service slides are mock-ups to help you imagine how monitors could track these issues. They don't actually see a specific real contract. So for this box, your job as monitors would be to compare the names in the documents with the names in the contract. So who signs the supervision reports? Whose logo do you see on the drawings or the training materials? Which lab issues the test certificates? And which trainers appear on attendance lists? You then check whether those names appear in the expert list and subcontractor list of the contract. If everything lines up, here you tick yes, and maybe even note reports signed by the same engineers listed as key experts 1 and 2. But if you see a different company or even different individuals, for example supervision reports signed by Local Engineering Limited, even though the contract is with Big Consult International, and there's no mention of local engineering in the subcontractor list at all, that's clearly where Corruption Scheme 3 and access denial come in. So hidden implementers are undeclared subcontracting. The firm that won the tender might just be a front, passing the work onto a connected local company that never actually competed. Downgraded teams or ghost experts may also be involved. The bid mentions senior international engineers, but on the ground all the work that you've seen is done by junior staff or a cheaper local firm. So while the invoices still charge top rates, small infrastructure projects can directly affect quality and safety. So think of a road supervision done by an unlisted local office or concrete tests done by a lab that doesn't even meet the standards. Your role isn't to judge whether these people are competent, but it is to document the gap between what was promised and what actually happened. So recording that gap in a simple way by ticking no and listing the unexpected names gives anti-corruption bodies and contracting authorities a clear starting point to ask follow-up questions. Thank you for staying with me through part 4 of Module 3. In this final part of the module, we stayed inside the same Step 2 logic, but we stopped thinking only about construction works. Instead, we asked a what-if question. So if this reporting tool wanted to look at goods and services as well, what extra checks would be most useful for corruption risks? To answer that, we built hypothetical add-ons that appear through a drop-down only when the monitor selects goods or services. These are mock-ups, not real projects, but they do show how the same approach could travel across different types of contracts. First, we looked at goods. So if the monitor selects goods, 3 clusters of extra questions appear. First, access and obstruction, an early warning indicator. We kept the basic site visit question, were you able to carry out a site visit, but we strengthened the no path. The add-on asks whether the monitor tried to see where the item are actually stored or installed through a storeroom, a warehouse, or end-user location, and if access is still blocked, who prevented it and why. This doesn't necessarily create a new corruption scheme, but obstruction is a risk indicator. In practice, repeated or unexplained refusals to show the goods after signal someone is worried about what a monitor might discover under Corruption Scheme 1, 2 or 3, so unjustified changes, missing items or even irregular subcontracting. Second, we moved on to delivery versus payment, classic Corruption Scheme 2 territory. So here we gave monitors concrete hooks to compare paper and reality for a few checked items. The add-ons asked, do the invoices and packing lists match with the model, specification and quantity of what was actually received? Were any required conformity documents necessary? And were serial or lot numbers recorded? And after the existing question on whether issued payments look consistent, we also added, do paid quantities match received quantities for the items you checked? Now, these are all different types of ways of spotting Corruption Scheme 2, substandard or undelivered outputs compared to the payments. But you might see cheaper models instead of the specified ones, ghost items that are paid but not received, or even missing conformity documents that suggest quality and safety corners have been cut. Then we moved to declared versus observed implementers, patterns that point to Corruption Scheme 3, and sometimes even Corruption Scheme 2. So finally here we thought about who moves and installs the goods, and what happens after delivery. The add-on asked whether any third-party logistics providers or installers were used who are not listed in the contractor or subcontractor list, and it asks whether warranty activation, user manuals and basic training reached the end user. Now used together, these checks help you spot typical Corruption Scheme 3 patterns: undeclared subcontractors, politically connected logistics firms that appear from nowhere, or even after-sales obligations quietly dropping once the invoice has been paid. So missing training and warranties are not a separate scheme, but they are red flags that the promised service package around the goods has not been fully delivered, again tying back to Corruption Scheme 2 for value for money. Then we turn to services. So if the monitor selects services, a different set of add-ons appear, again mapped back to the same 3 schemes. First we started with delivery versus payment, so acceptance of services. This first extra question asks whether deliverables were accepted in writing against the stated criteria, and invites the monitor to record the acceptance note, date or file reference, which mirrors exactly what we did for works. We want a clear, dated yes that something was delivered before money flows. Weak or absent acceptance is a clear risk indicator that Corruption Scheme 2 may be present, so the money going out without a solid evidence that the reports, designs and trainings really met what was promised. Then we move to delivery versus payment, so time versus outputs. A second add-on under the payments question asks, for time-based contracts, whether timesheets or activity logs are reconciled to outputs. Now, the monitor does not need to redo a full audit here. You simply need to check whether billed days have a reasonable trace in real work. But when they don't, for example many days invoiced but only a short memo delivered, it's again a very concrete Corruption Scheme 2 pattern, overbilling and ghost work. Then we move to modifications in practice, which links back to scope creep. So where there are modifications, an extra question asks whether any extensions or new tasks were formally signed and justified before delivery. This is not necessarily a new scheme, but it's simply the services version of Corruption Scheme 1, so unjustified contract modifications and scope creep. Repeated extensions, vague justifications and retroactive amendments are all risk indicators that Corruption Scheme 1 may be at play here. Then we move to declared versus observed implementers, so who actually did the work. Now, finally, the services add-on asks whether the authors and consultants named in the deliverables match the supplier and subcontractor list. It lets the monitor list any names that do not appear there. So when sometimes called ghost experts or hidden subs, they're not actually separate schemes, but they're just typical corruption scheme 3 patterns, so regular undisclosed subcontracting, or even teams that look very different from what was evaluated in the tender. So when a contract charges for senior experts, but the work is actually done by juniors, it all has a corruption scheme 2 angle because the public buyer is paying for a level of services that they did not actually receive. So all of these you see here, hypothetical add-ons, they all lead to one simple message. Whether we're looking at works, goods, or services, everything still comes back to the same 3 corruption schemes. Are modifications transparent, justified, and signed in time? Do quantities, qualities, and payments line up with what exists on the ground or in use? And lastly, do the companies and people actually doing the work match those selected in the contract, or are there undeclared players in the background? So access obstruction, missing documents, strange installers, vague acceptances, or even ghost experts, all of these are risk indicators that help you spot where corruption scheme 1, 2, or 3 might be hiding. Taken together, parts 1 to 4 of Module 3 have clearly given you a complete toolkit view of a small public investment, from the files to the construction site, to the goods delivered and the services wrapped around them. In Module 4, we stay in the construction sector but zoom in on environmental mitigation measures, drainage retention, basins, greenery, noise protection, and dust control. We will see how those elements, which often sit at the edge of the budget, can be both an environmental issue and a classic corruption scheme 2 problem when they're not implemented as promised. We will also practice how to integrate environmental observations into the same reporting tool you've used in this module. Before starting Module 4, however, I invite you to think of one real project in your country. Maybe it's one you've been using throughout Module 3, and imagine you're standing on that site with Step 2 questions in your hand. Ask yourself, what would I see about quantities, quality, logos, and supervision? And then, what would I notice about the environmental measures, the drainage, the trees, the dust, and noise control? Bring that mental picture with you to the next module so that the environmental checks feel just as concrete as the construction ones have. Thank you for completing Module 3.